The SBC was founded in 8th of July of 1948. Afterwards, this date was considered National Date for Sciences. In this time, after the Second World War, the institute and universities in Brazil had a big struggle. That was the reason for this coming together. They were founded by Maurício Silva and others. During the military dictatorship, it was a huge meeting point and experience exchange hub. It was the big voice of education and science in Brazil. The SBPC became the center of the national debate for sciences. This was a period that consolidated SBPC, the flame of the scientific ideals. The structure was strengthened, becoming an icon for the fight for better public policies, democracies, defending the sustainable development of the country. Nowadays, the SBPC represents thousands of scientists, students, and friends of sciences, integrating more than 140 scientific associations, many that were founded in the core of this entity. And we have 5 main topics. Collaborate with the Brazilian scientific and technological development to fight for the quality of university of education, to defend the interests of scientists, to promote the dissemination of the scientific knowledge through many actions, and fight against the obstacles that hinder the progress of science. The SBPC has a rich history of contribution for the political and scientific development of the country, developing many acts and laws like the Forest Act and the Biodiversity Act. It also promotes the development of the scientific knowledge in his meetings throughout the country.
De Ciência e Inovação de São Paulo faz parte de uma rede de 5 centros. Nós temos um centro em Nova York, um em Moscou, um em Nova Delhi e um em Tóquio. E essa rede de centros está hoje dentro do DAD.
O DAD é o Serviço Alemão de Intercâmbio Acadêmico. E nós somos uma organização que representa do ensino superior na Alemanha. E nosso objetivo é de promover a internacionalização dos estudos superiores no mundo inteiro.
O encontro das pessoas, dos grupos de pesquisadores, das universidades é muito importante e isso é uma base da nossa cooperação com o Brasil mesmo.
A cooperação entre duas comunidades científicas é muito produtiva, em geral causando impactos sempre maiores do que iniciativas de pesquisa feitas isoladamente.
A DWIH, como uma sociedade científica aqui, que tem uma ciência de excelência absoluta e alta tecnologia, é extremamente proveitosa essas parcerias.
E a parceria entre o setor privado e o mundo científico é fundamental para promover as relações bilaterais.
Bom dia, Brasil.
Good morning, Brazil. Good afternoon to all others that are in Germany. Welcome to the Roundtable to Science, Freedom and Democracy. As a part of the 73rd annual meeting of the Brazilian Society for the Advancement of Science, the SBPC. This roundtable is being transmitted in the same channel in 2 languages, Portuguese and English. If you want to, please click on the video to hear the debate in another language. So I will continue in Portuguese, and this is the national language here. The Brazilian Center for Scientists and Innovation, the DWIH, is part of this meeting since 2010, and since 2015 promotes, in partnership with SBPC, a roundtable about management and academic scientific policies. In the last year, represented the DAAD, the DWIH became an institutional partner of the SBPC. Today, we bring you great names of the academy in Brazil and Germany. What is the relation between science, freedom, and democracy? What is the importance of liberty, academic liberty, and science? Why do science needs freedom? We suggested this topic to the SBPC, to our roundtable, because it's very actual in the whole world and has an important place in the DAAD strategy for 2025. I would like to read some sentences of this document related to this topic of scientific freedom. In many places in the world, it's possible to see tendency to restrictions to the scientific freedom. Scientists are being confronted with censorship and prohibitions in their workplaces, and they're forced to leave their countries. This also impacts the international cooperation. Exchange students and professors in Germany are being confronted with these restrictions, making them to confront difficult situations, even dangerous situations. This may make more difficult the coordination of exchange topics. The DAAD, the biggest organization of knowledge exchange in the world, observed this evolution of the situation in the whole world, orienting German organizations to have a better position to free expression and free opinion. The Friedrich Alexander Erlangen Nuremberg University says that almost 80% of the world population lives in countries that constrict the academic freedom. In the spirit of the DAD and the Foreign Ministry of Germany launched a program called Hildemin for countries where people cannot live their scientific career. People that were selected for this program will be allowed to visit a graduation course in Germany. The next time to get into these courses will be in January 2020. More information you can have on our website. Before we begin with our roundtable, important notice. We have a huge polarization where free debate of ideas are not possible. Comments on chats, in the chat that are aggressive or not correct can be monitored. Hate manifestations will not be tolerated. Please keep yourself to the topic or to the roundabout. All other interventions are very welcome. Also, questions to our speakers, they will be happy to get. I want to invite for the moderation of the roundtable, Professor Maria Filomena of the University of Campinas. She is graduate in social sciences at UNICAMP with a master's and doctorate in anthropology at the University of São Paulo. She is specialized in urban violence, youth, and gender studies. She has a postdoctorate in studies of Latin American studies, is a full teacher at UNICAMP, and also visiting professor in Columbia University in New York. Professor, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm sorry for the long introduction, but now you have the floor. I come back at the end of the debate. Good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you here in São Paulo. It's quite cold, and you in Germany, it's hot. It's irony in the situation that we are living. But let's begin with this roundtable that has the topic to discuss the relation between science, freedom, and democracy. This initiative has a relationship of the SBC and the German Services for Science and Innovation. I want to thank you, Mr. Hellman, the director of the DWIH in Brazil, and the director that introduced ourselves here. I also want to thank you for the presence of Otávio Velho and before introducing the German professors and hand over the word to them, I want to make a short introduction. I'm here as the coordinator of the Research Science and Freedom Observatory, and it has the outstanding leadership of Ildeu Moreira Fernando Sobral and esteemed Otávio Velho that is here with us, the honorary president of the SBPC and member of our commission. And I want to make concrete this articulation, which adds to the varied actions of SBC in defense of Brazilian science
and defense of its associates. This observatory follows a line that is a tradition that has fought dictatorships in Brazil and that has been extremely important for the political opening in the 80s and has had a great support in and contributed to the Constitution of 88 that ensures a full manifestation and freedom of thought, as well as freedom to talk and scientific cultural freedom as written in Article 5, paragraphs 9 and 18, and with the proposal of ensuring the freedom of Brazilians. The Constitution also sets in Article 206 that teaching will be based on the principles of free learning, diffusing knowledge, as well as a pluralism of ideas and democratic management of public teaching. In Article 207, the Constitution also ensures the autonomy of scientific, administrative, data, and financial management of public universities. In the last few years, these assurances have not been followed or respected. Recently, we have seen several initiatives that have been deployed and that go against the essential freedom for the production and disclosure of scientific knowledge and data, affecting directed teachers, researchers, technicians, reporters, and other social agents. Despite the reactions and vigilance of the highest courts in Brazil, these initiatives have affected universities, scientific agencies, and private and public scientific research agencies, and has offended, disqualified, and attacked and constrained the financing and pursuing the professionals that deal with topics that are considered either as inadequate or inappropriate by these local or national authorities. I believe that this is the moment that this initiative is the opportunity that we have to set the parameters that this debate must follow. We know that the unqualification and pursuits against the people, if on the one hand they show that there is a negativity, that they also bring in the possibility to think about academic production and why it should be defended by our constitution. It's not just about following constitutional principles in an unthoughtful way, but rather to put in evidence the impacts for all society and for the new generations of these attacks to freedom. When we talk about academic research, scientific freedom, we must highlight something that is not obvious, that is what is defined as academic freedom includes long training and a solid base that will lead to good questions that will be able to put on the question all the accepted ideas, and that question also technological advances with the protection of natural resources and the defense of the planet and the laws. And these attacks to freedom with these systematic criticism and disposal that these precepts that like those that start with the attacks on these principles, confusing liberty with attacks affect all of us as a collective body. And we need support from the public in a broad way, and especially we need social responsibility to ensure the well-being through the respect of rights conquered by human beings in their several dimensions, and also the conviction that climate change, like in the case of Brazil, are strongly involved in the deforestation, are at the core of political problems that are directly linked to injustice and social inequalities. What the world has realized and science and research has made public is that intrinsically these things are linked: biodiversity, social diversity, environmental protection, and the quest for freedom, both at the social and environmental level. So the accumulation of social knowledge, the capacity to produce new knowledge, affects the life and well-being and in the broader perspectives. And this is what we must protect and ensure. We should also remember that the increasing vulnerability of social democratic institutions bring to science, and in the case of Brazil, I mean social sciences. This is not protected. We have also seen that it has been treated as a falsity and take off the respect of society. Science works with methods and techniques and with data produced and public institutions of research that have been made vulnerable currently, and that, however, are absolutely fundamental for the production of knowledge. Well, before I give the floor to the next speaker, speak about the importance of this initiative of SBPC to create the Observatory of Science and Liberty, in the sense that it has at its mission to monitor the things that are taking place, and also mobilize society, and also check on any attempt against freedom to teach, to research, or to disclose knowledge among us. And I would like to conclude my speech by sharing with you an excerpt from a comment that is very sharp, written by Anna Ernst and Summer Times in that applies directly to the situation that Brazil is going through, but also through the situation that 80% of the population in the world is suffering with the constraints to their freedom of thought and produce knowledge. And she says, if the if the government's function is to open eyes and to question in situations in which it can saw through acts and words what they can do, the shadows arrived when the light is extinguished through efforts of invisible governments and through discourse that does not show what it is, but starts with moral exhortations that, under the pretext of defending old freedoms, denies freedom and allows a triviality that is nonsensical. It is against this normalization and silence that is imposed that I believe this roundtable and the observatory are made. It is very relevant for us to ponder on this discussion of freedom. And this said, I would like to begin our roundtable now for real, introducing Professor Otávio Velho, who is a professor of the Federal University of Janeiro, honorary president of the Society for the Advancement of Science, permanent member of the National Museum Congregation, and also member of the CAPS board. He has a great many books and articles published that is extremely important, especially versing on the discussion of authoritarian capitalism and talking about the problems of that attack freedom, and also has vast experience in this interface between philosophy, anthropology, and constant dialogue with other segments of science that allows us to carry out a very fruitful discussion that is extremely important on the topic that we propose to discuss today. I would like to give the floor to Professor Otávio Velho. Thank you very much, Professor. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues. Professor Maria Filomena has given us a good idea of the situation we are living in Brazil, and also the research observatory on science and liberty that she coordinates and that has been created by the Brazilian Society for the Advancement of Science, who is our host today in our annual meeting that is being virtual because of the pandemic that we are going through. I would like to call your attention to the fact that Professor Maria Filomena already mentioned this fact, and in this difficult situation we are going through, social sciences and humanities, generally speaking, have been the preferential target, and even members of the administration say that it is a cultural war. The term is not ours, it is used by members of the administration themselves, which shows that they are warring against the science, and it's an anti-intellectualist movement that is spreading from the administration through to society with the sponsoring of the government itself. This situation, as I said, affects essentially human science or humanity, and also this affects our colleagues, especially when they are forced to go to court to defend themselves against accusations that are oftentimes based on national security laws that come from dictatorship times. So it is important to take that into consideration. I would also like to add that these difficulties, these perceptions, vary often from case to case and from discipline to discipline. Professor Maria Filomena and I are anthropologists. She, up to a while ago, was the president of the Brazilian Society of Anthropology. Anthropologists suffer from this kind of difficulty with the additional item that they are seen and identified with the populations they study, who are the people they talk to, who give them information. These have consequences that are very painful, not only for the populations, the native populations, and the anthropologists that are identified with us. We also have this situation of the demarcation of the invasion of native lands through illegal mining in large, that increasing. The anthropologists are being accused precisely, and the aim, in fact, is to affect the native populations they work with, who are their contacts. But especially with regards to this comment made on the social science and humanities, the whole of science have been affected actively by this situation. The central topic of these meetings which are taking part is that all science are humanities are essential to society, and this title has been given by SBPC, and it shows the support that science has received from other areas. And this is the central topic of this annual meeting. The fact is, receive solidarity from colleagues in other areas that we appreciate. On the other hand, we're talking not only of solidarity, but also of sensitivity to the fact that if human science are the ones to be the most heavily affected, the attack to social science is just one facet of an attack of the restriction to the whole of science. And it is very important to highlight this. This has been observed by our colleagues, and in the more direct rate to the cutting down on budgets. Our institutions are living precariously due to the constraints of funding. And I'm happy that it has been mentioned here in the initial presentation that Germany is welcoming with open arms colleagues who are being pursued or are in a dire situation. But I also say that with a heavy heart, because we do not like to lose these colleagues who are among us. But this is a symptom of the situation we are undergoing. And there is no question that Brazil is a very extreme case at the moment of attack to science, and it's important that our German colleagues realize this. However, this should not decrease this observation that I'm doing here. This should not reduce our interest to know what is taking place, what is taking place in the rest of the world, in order not to have a distorted vision. We should not restrict ourselves to our own province, so to speak, and we must look at the rest of the world. As researchers, since we are political players, we must know what is taking place and resist what is happening, but we must also keep our posture as observers of what is taking place and trying to get some distance from what is happening to be able to observe. We have used, as part of the resistance, we have used some generalizations that are necessary for this political resistance. what is happening in Brazil to the rest of the world to showcase the irrationality of the governmental policy, or the lack of a policy, or the anti-politics that are precisely putting under attack science and scientists. We have used international examples to show that in the country we are going against the more general trends that exist in the world. This is a general observation that we make, especially with regards to the resistance to
the level of the drastic budget cuts. And this is getting and hitting the general society of scientists. The relation of science and development. I'm sorry, the original sound is gone. We are just waiting for the original sound to come back. The most recent example that we saw is the announcement of the huge increase in research and science that was done by the Biden government. But still, it's very important to remember that this increase of investment that was announced by the American government explicitly is part of the new external foreign policies of the country. That's very important. Explicitly, it's a question of competing with China. It also has a very huge importance in the freedom of research. This is part of the foreign policies and the foreign competition. And this is also a way to restrict the freedom of research if this is directed to a certain topic. So we need to have better comparisons, what we do in Brazil to what is done abroad. I need to recognize that this huge investment can make more money free for free research, but you need a more sophisticated approach as researchers, that we are, even if we need to resist politically to the situation that we are living in. And I believe that our German counterparts will talk about this too. And China, that we just talked about, brings us to another question: the relation between sciences and democracy. Since we are resisting to the authoritarianism that we are being underdue, the scientific development that we are seeing in China must be considered. So how can we make a better, more sophisticated science without abandoning this question of science and democracy? But we need to go from this generic observation and understand better these cases like China, so we can have a better and more sophisticated analysis, and then we can have a better political debate. I don't have an answer to this question. Maybe my German colleagues can help us with that. I'm just suggesting that it's just a challenge, a further challenge that we have as researchers. I also want to remember that another generalization that we try to do here in defending our science is to highlight the utility of science. I would say that this is very important. But I still need to pay attention to the fact that this argument is not absolute. The science must be justified by its utility, in my opinion. And it's important to think the utility to whom, because when we put in a general words the fact of utility, who, for whom is the building of hydroelectric equipment in Amazon, who will benefit from it and who will have problems with that? This is something that we will talk about in the political resistance, but between colleagues, we should talk about that here. And at the end, I want to share with you individual question, how to confront the fundamentalists, the people that deny everything without being captured by the ethos of these adversaries, creating a kind of scientific salvation that is denying the capacity of doubt without bringing upon us absolute answers. It seems to me that Brazil is showing us now, and the world also, and this is even difficult for some scientists to understand that there is no natural evolution in the direction of reason and science. How to deal with that without illusions? Without illusions that things naturally go into this direction of illuminism, enlightenment. How can we be at the side of science and reason in the discussion of policies? This is an irony that we have to confront, because in the politics, as the philosopher Spinoza said, in imagination we have our things that we like, and this can also be surpassed by other affections. Thank you very much. I end here. Very important topics that you brought that are very modern, very actual, and is part of our dilemmas in science, since science is science. So now we will hand over the floor to Professor Michael Quante, that is a philosopher, and it's professor at the Münster University in philosophy. He has a specialization in philosophy and is also part of a very interesting group that articulates science and religion, and is also part of a group that works with bioethics. He will bring us very interesting topics to this discussion. He was also the president of the Rectory for Post-Graduation, and president worked of the Internationalization of Knowledge at the University of Münster. He has a lot of published books. And has many studies about the freedom of the individual, the science, and certainly his contribution will be very rich regarding ethics, and he will talk to us about scientific freedom on the philosophic side as a negative liberty and a positive freedom. The last, in the abstract of his speech, is to determine the finality of the science as something central in modern societies. It's a pleasure, Professor Michael, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, for having me on the round table here to a very important topic. I have prepared some slides, and I don't know whether they are shown now or whether they are not shown. Okay, that's wonderful. So I hope everybody is in a position to see that, and we can start with the first slide. I don't do that myself. We arranged it that another person is pressing the button now for me, so it should be done now. Okay. As a philosopher, I would like to add a few conceptual distinctions and a few additional problems to all the things already mentioned and already alluded to here, to sort out some issues. And for sure, especially in Brazil, but also in other parts of the world, science and scientists do have a lot of reason to fight against bad influences and oppression of all kind. But I think if we think about the relation between science and democracy, we also have to think about what these modern constellations do mean for us as a social institution called science, and as persons called scientists who are also part of a civic society playing their role therein. I don't think there is only one relation between science and democracy, but a lot of different relations having different layers and also having opposite tendencies, so that your overall dialectical situation is much more complicated and less straightforward as it might seem on the first glance. And I try to sort out the issues a little bit to prepare the discussion later. And we can look at it in two directions. I should say first that when I use the notion of science, I do cover all kinds of sciences, humanities, arts, and the natural sciences, as we say in Germany. And we can ask what is the most important, and this will be a little abstract for making this point, role and function of science for democracies. Maybe press the next button, we get the sub-points then, which I want to mention and explain. Well, the first, obviously, and this has been shown in the last 1.5 years due to the pandemic, modern democracies cannot solve all the problems we have as individuals, as societies, and as humankind on this planet without basing politics and social policies on scientific knowledge. And most of these problems cannot be solved by only one science-produced knowledge, but has to be based on scientific knowledge gained in interdisciplinary discourse and gained in an interdisciplinary rule of the arguments and the data, etc. At least we in Germany could see that we as science as a system also still have to learn to better organize our disciplinary knowledge among each other to present a kind of interdisciplinary knowledge apt for the problems which normally have to be addressed from more than one science, because most of these things are not only globally complex but also scientifically complex. But scientific knowledge, I think, is a necessary element for a rationally based politics which is able to master it, or at least live with the most global challenges. Democracies who ignore their scientific knowledge will fail to solve the problems we have in short term, or at least in middle term, dramatically. I think the way different countries have come through the pandemic and other great crises demonstrates this, so that I don't need to deliver further evidence. The second thing, which I think is as important as the knowledge sciences produce, is a kind of virtue. Every person who has studied will not only gain competencies due to their science and will gain a special kind of knowledge, but by being trained in science, you also develop what I call the scientific stance. It is a kind of virtue. And this is basically, to make a complex thing very easy, the need to get justifications if opinions or arguments are presented, to ask for the reasons. It is the need and the duty to deliver arguments for their own position and thesis and arguments. It is the stance to rely on rationality and critical thinking to prove the informations before relying on them, and to be informed before starting to criticize something. And finally, the scientific stance is a complicated issue because it tries to combine the option that our best knowledge is fallible and can be demonstrated to be false in the long run without being skeptics. This means we have to rely and are obliged to rely on the best knowledge we have at hand in a given situation, but we also have to be open-minded that it might be that other arguments falsify these information, so that we are critic and self-critic all the way down without losing trust in what we gain as knowledge based on scientific research. This is really one of the main obstacles, because especially in terms of crisis, many people would like to have safe knowledge which is demonstrated to be successful in application and impossible to refute or to falsify, but these kinds of knowledge are hard to have. As a philosopher, I would say we never will have it, but even having said that, we shouldn't make the wrong conclusion that everything now is only opinion without degrees in being justified and rational. And having this learned to be in between this falsification, critical stance, and trust in rational argument and trust in scientifically based knowledge is what is needed for every single person in a modern society. And this is what I will call the scientific stance as a civic virtue. Without democracy cannot work. And this has to be transported in all persons who are teachers somewhere, even we scientists in a private context. If we discuss with friends and others somewhere about pressing political or other issues, always present ourselves as representing the scientific stance as a core rational being in the world, without which we cannot live together in a democratic society. I think this is a very basic but very important task of our educational aims beyond the specialized knowledge produced in each single science. So let me have a look now on the other side of this constellation, looking from the democracy to science. First of all, if I say democracy, I have in mind a society which delivers a pluralistic environment. Pluralistic means individual conceptions of a good life and being autonomous beings are respected. We have different social groups. We have different social values embedded in these. And we live in a society which is dynamic in many respects, driven by scientific and technological developments which change a lot and in the last centuries they change or nearly everything in a very high speed, so that the democracy is a kind of heated, enriched, pluralistic, and in some sense also dialectical environment, offering several different faces and different aspects, some of them fascinating for scientists, others threatening us, others boring us. So it's not only a one thing, but a very complicated thing. And to add one more, democracy is not only what we do when we elect or not elect, it is the way we deal with each other. Democracy is what I would like to call a life form and not only a political structure, institution of a special kind. So this is what I have in mind, a pluralistic, dynamic, modern society, and democracy as a way in which autonomy is respected and the possibility to be part of the political is offered to everybody. Next. And now it comes to freedom. This is the third notion which gives the topic of our today's roundtable. And democracy is, in some sense, speaking and as a political philosopher, an institutional design for individual and social freedom. And without freedom, democracy can't survive. You cannot repress people and save some structures you call democracies. We had some variants of democracies which had some aspects which are distinguished from aristocracies or other things, but in which individual freedom to live one's own consumption of a good life, freedom of thought and speech were suppressed. And in this way, you cannot have the other structures of a democracy. So freedom here is a value term, not a metaphysical one, but it's a value term. It means something which is important for ethics and for political philosophy. And normally you can spell it out in terms of rights, of duties. And as usual, when you go to the philosophy department, there is more than one meaning to these basic terms, and there is more than one conception of these basic terms. And I think for our question, how freedom, science, and democracy are interrelated in the various constellations, it is helpful to use a very basic and, for a philosopher, crude distinction, which I would like to explain on the next slide. In political philosophy and in some parts of ethics, there is a basic distinction called negative and positive freedom. To make it very simple here, because I'm not giving a philosophy lecture and there is not a philosophical audience out there, negative freedom can be understood as the right of non-interference. If you want to have it very trivial, you can say, my home is my castle. And this could mean, in our context, that the sciences say, science is doing what science is doing, and all we need from society is don't intervene, let us do what we want to do when we stick to our rules. That would be negative freedom. And in some sense, the right based on negative freedom is that others are not allowed to interfere into my own autonomous decisions and will, and I have the right to define my concept and my plans myself. In the political sense, you are allowed to rule and give yourself the rules. And as needless to say, a lot of things we do in science as an institutional part of society is based on this idea of no other social institution, political institution, or whatever interfering with the way we give ourselves our regulations, define our methods, define our rules. And in this sense, negative freedom is an important aspect, especially if we see, and we have heard a lot of these examples, if other forces try to invade science bringing their interests and rules into our field and try to force us to change the rules of our game in several ways, not only on an individual level by all kinds of pressures, but also as a social institution as such, by giving a political, legal, and economic surrounding which tries to have a reconstruction within this institution of science based on other external interests, not in the interest of the sciences and science as such. But there's more to freedom than negative freedom. And the notion of positive freedom has a long tradition, and you can combine it with two ideas. The first is that freedom of an individual, let's take this example, cannot be fostered only by not intervening. If you have a newborn baby and you say, well, I don't interfere in its life so it can lead its life autonomously, this baby will die. It's a very easy example, but it means you need an enabling environment so that people and institutions and sciences can realize what they have defined autonomously as their own goals. They cannot do it without external structures and resources. They are not, to use an old term, autark in that sense. So the one thing is you need enabling environments which have to be guaranteed, and a lot of the guarantees of this enabling environment sciences need cannot be produced and guaranteed by sciences themselves. We have seen the economic structure and all these as very good examples. The next part in the notion of positive freedom is a kind of teleological thinking. And you know that from sports, for example, if you say that you have a young person very talented, and this means you can allow this human being to develop its talent, so to become a very good, very famous sportsman, whatever you want, artist. And this means you understand someone having a potential, and positive freedom is the right and the duty to realize this special potential within it. And if you can say that sciences, disciplines, or science as such, has a kind of internal telos, there is something it is striving at, and it has some potentials which are not realized fully actually, or are still to be discovered probably. It can be an open process. And in this sense, non-interference, which is at the heart of the negative freedom, simply is not enough. If we think of science as part of a society which is somehow in need of being enabled by society, we have a more dialectical relation that part of the environment also will give sciences the shape and other maybe even goals or intermediate goals in which they can develop themselves. You can, by political and social measures, encourage sciences, you can encourage scientists as you can threaten them, and you can motivate young people to become scientists. And this cannot be done by science alone, because this kind of education starts much earlier than people are confronted with sciences. And this is why I think the scientific stance, the knowing and the willingness to say to young humans that being a scientist, being aware of science is an important element to live an autonomous, responsible individual life and to be part of a flourishing pluralistic democracy, is a target of education, and this target should be realized even if those who are educated in this spirit don't enter universities, or if they do, don't stay their life as a scientist within one of the sciences. But this basic civic virtue is the background needed for having an environment in which the enabling function of a democratic society is such that the potentials of science can foster in the long run. And this conception is much more than the negative idea. In the negative, you could say, if we isolate science from all the rest influences, it is free in itself and nothing can happen anymore. But as in a famous pop song later ago, it's freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. But that's negative freedom only. And I think the freedom we need as scientists in democracy and the freedom democracies need for science to have in them a strong partner to master the problems is some aspects of positive freedom too. And this makes things much more complicated because simply no intervenience and everybody in his own castle and don't touch me is not the right solution. We need the right kinds of interactions and we don't need the idea of no interaction at all. And I say this because sometimes I experience in the mind of scientists who are having made bad experiences in trying to be part of society, that they have this idea of going to the what we are sometimes sent to as philosophy ivory tower, in which we do what we want to do, but we are not in a contact, in a relation with the social world anymore. This can't be the answer. And this should not be the ideal of scientists, but they should think about this negative and positive aspects of freedom needed to be part of a democratic society as scientists. And this is a complicated topic, and there is a lot to be clarified. And if social situations change, to be reshaped, reinvented, and maybe reconstructed. So let's go to the next slide, please. Well, in philosophy, Wittgenstein once said you can have a problem if you think about something, if you orient yourself only to one kind of problems. And this is what I called one-sided diet. And if you press the button once more, please. We had some examples. Maybe you can press 2 times more. We have all what I want to say here. And one more. Yeah. I think all these examples we have heard today, we face strong oppression by states against sciences and scientists. Scientists are prosecuted, and there are a lot of ideological fetters blocking the internal development of sciences, forbidding research programs, ruling them by ideological premises, etc. All these are big problems. Many of them simply are crimes, and they all need that we shout out loud that we don't do it and that we fight it. That's the obvious part, and it's a pressing and problematic part. And to be honest, actually, I do live in a country where I'm most of the time not under threat of this kind of examples, and this is a different situation in your country, in Brazil, for example, actually, as far as I know, and most of the people would agree. But there are also structural threats, less visible, but in the long run, as important and as powerful as the other ones. And I call them structural threats because if you have a non-fully economically sufficient established science or university, which needs to gain money by applying in research programs, it can be, and it actually happens everywhere as far as I see, that research programs deliver topics which have not been selected by the sciences themselves, but by other interests, the interests of political parties, of society as such, etc. Some of this agenda setting may be fully justifiable because it's a total legitimate question. Take climate research, for example, but the threat here is that the more you need the money of research programs, which are devoted to special kinds of questions and a special kind of research, the less science or sciences and scientists are free to choose their own research interests, to be autonomous in their agenda setting. So this structural threat seems to be part of the positive freedom because we can get extra money by applying, but it is also a threat to negative freedom because we are invaded there by being sent to areas and debates and questions not all of us would think are the most important in terms of science. So this is a complicated issue here, and the more we have to apply for these things, and the less these programs are only oriented towards scientific interests, the more we have the possibility of invading into the agenda setting of sciences. Another example is, we have seen the vaccination research. You can have private economic interests, very influential in some parts of sciences, and this can result in problematic structures. You are not allowed to publish results if they are not in the interest of those who paid for you. And you can have the problem that products of your science, be it technological transfer or a medicine, is privately owned and not available for the public. And this can also cause problems in terms of science as part of the democracy. And I think you should press one more. There is an imperative, and I think it has been mentioned today too. There is the imperative by those who invest tax money, research money, private money into science, that they can see a direct result in terms of direct applicability, the so-called quick wins, and they reduce the usability of scientific knowledge to economic usability to make money out of it. If you don't reduce the notion of usability to economic usability, but have a wide notion, I don't have a problem to say that it has to have some purpose and may be useful for something, science as such. If you reduce it to economic usability, I would say with Marx, you reduce something which has an intrinsic value to an instrument only to produce money out of something, and this causes alienation and it changes the motivation of everybody, because now you're not doing research because you are interested in the topic, but you do it because you are interested in the money you can make of it. And this in the end destroys the scientific stance, and this means that we have to fight this latent idea that science in a democracy, because it's publicly funded, has to be good for something. I would say, if you say it is good for a just and ethically acceptable society, I don't have any problem with that. If it is reduced to economic usability, I would say we have to fight this, because this is one other way to reduce what we can do. And yes, actually, in this idea of applied science, normally the humanities and the social sciences are more under attack than the natural sciences. But if you have a closer look, that's not true. If you come to the very fundamental research in natural sciences, they also do have the problem that it's hard to get money for their research programs, because it simply is not clear at all, or at least not very quickly the case, that they can be used for applicability, technology transfer or something like this. So these are some structural threats beyond what we already discussed and what is actually probably more pressing. But these structures there in the long run also are a threat for both the idea of science and the scientific stance. And also, if a society reduces itself to these thinking, it is a threat to democracy in the end, because you have instrumental reason all the way down only, and you don't focus on ethically relevant questions. So maybe we go to the next slide, please. if I'm right and democracy cannot maintain and answer the huge challenges without scientific knowledge, and if I'm also right that parts of what makes the virtue of a scientist are also virtues you need as a democratic person, rationality, justification, falsification, anti-fundamentalism, all these things. The question is how we can interact. First of all, and I mention here 3 pillars, and they are all meant as a challenge for both sides, for the people within the sciences and universities and in the society. We have to communicate. And this means we as scientists, first of all, have to communicate our scientific findings such that they are telling to those who are not part of science themselves. This is a kind of knowledge transfer. But science has to do more than knowledge transfer, because communication never is a one-way road. And we have to learn to listen to what the people ask and want from sciences, and to start about discussion and also learn what local knowledge is and what the questions people have in their surroundings pose, and we have to take them very serious and to use this knowledge and to ask them how and integrate it into our questions and research. So we should be open to listen to the society and don't reduce ourselves to those who know it better and need easy language to tell it to those who are less enlightened. This is a non-democratic stance we have to overcome as scientists, and we should make this by having a good conception of knowledge transfer and science communication part of the education of every student in our universities, and there's a lot to be done there, I think. Second is we need formats in which societies, civil societies, NGOs, individual persons can participate in sciences in different roles. Only if we can establish interrelations and cooperation, we can overcome the problem that there is a split between the science on the one hand and the society on the other, because people are interacting, know each other, and there is a kind of transparency. If we do have this on a very basic level, political classes or even individual political figures will have a much harder job if they want to split sciences and scientists from their communities. It is easier to have a split between these two parts if there is no knowledge of each other or even a kind of mistrust in each other. If there is this, there is a lot of political tactics and strategies to bring people against science and telling all these things you have already mentioned, the populists who are normally anti-intellectualists and anti-scientists, etc. The more we are part of society in this participation, and civil sciences, citizen science is a name for something like this, the less we are in danger to be separated from our democracy and our people by those who are interested to keep us separate and have a kind of extra section. Because if science is separated from the people, some political classes have an easier job to manipulate science and to oppress scientists than if we are part of the civil society. And the final thing is mutual trust in each other. And this means of every civil member of our democracy in what science is doing. And also the trust of each scientist that in the end, a normal member of our democratic state is a trustworthy communication and interaction partner, is the basic relation we need to overcome all the negative influences demonstrated by populists, anti-intellectualists, and all those political parties who oppress freedom of thought and freedom of living in the world. And we see this democracy is not only a part of a democratic political institution, but it's the way we interact. And if we don't interact democratically with our fellows as scientists, and if our fellows don't take science as part of their daily civic life, there always will be those who are interested in separating us to oppress those who are living an autonomous life and to follow their egoistic interests against what would be a good and justified life for all of them. And this is something we have to fight against by thinking about the best constellations between science, freedom, and democracy, and by asking each one of us, what's my duty, what's my stance, what are my virtues to participate in communication and mutual trust as the basic resource for democracy. Thank you very much.
This discussion that brings us this challenge to think about the relationships, the difficult relationships between science and democracy. Now I will hand over the floor and then we will have the debate. But now I want to hand over the floor to Professor Rudolf Stichweh. He is a sociologist and philosopher, and he has a very interesting thesis at the beginning of his education, that is the origins of physics as a scientific discipline, and that brings very important topics. He is a full professor about the relations between the formation of the national states and the development of the universities in Europe, in modern Europe. And from 1994 to 2013, he was a professor and works for many years in the University of Bielefeld, where he was rector between 1999 and 2001. He wrote a very important book about the theory of the world society and works at Bonn University in the comparison of democracies. And I believe that regarding this topic and reflection and discussion about this world society, he will talk about us today. It's a pleasure, Professor Rudolf. Now you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. But before, I have a question. I'm not quite sure how many time I have and how much time is left to us. I'm not sure. How many time do I have for my talk? Can anybody answer it?
Yeah, 20 minutes, please.
20 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. And I want to use a PowerPoint. Could you please? Yeah. I can't see the whole. Can you change it so that you can see the whole PowerPoint? Can you somehow change it? Because it's difficult for participants to read it. The beginning you can't see. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you very much. I intend to make some brief remarks on the historical evolution of freedom of science, which lead us to the contemporary situation and to the description and problems of freedom of science in our days. And there is a remarkable history and a remarkable dynamics in the history of freedom of science. And I primarily speak from a European perspective, but at the end, I intend to speak about world science as one global system. But at the beginning, it's about the beginnings of European science as an institution, and it starts around 1200 with the rise of the universities. And it's remarkable that in these early days, by scholars, science is often described as the third universal power of this contemporary situation. There is a church, there is the Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, and there is scholarship. Scholarship is a better term than science. And there is scholarship as a third universal power. And from this is often derived a certain very high status for persons participating in scholarship. And what is remarkable about the starting point of freedom of science, that at the beginning, freedom of science, as is the case with other medieval liberties, is primarily a kind of privilege claimed by persons and groups of high social status. That's the starting point. And I go on, and if you go a few centuries further on to the 16th, 17th century situation, you often find in self-descriptions of universities and scholarship the term libertas academica, academic liberty. There are plural understandings to it, but somehow the dominant understanding is that it means, again, certain liberties reserved to persons working at universities, a certain liberty of life forms who are not controlled from outside, but are controlled internal to the academy. But the other contemporary understanding primarily focuses on a certain freedom of choice of academic subjects, a freedom of choice given to teachers at universities. Even if you are a professor of logic, and that's the understanding, you are free to teach metaphysics or some other philosophical subject. And that's one core understanding of libertas academica in the 16th and 17th century. And then a next step, I restrict myself to some very fundamental steps. A next step may be identified in the late 18th century situation, in which I take, again, first the Latin term, a new freedom is claimed, which may be called libertas philosophandi, the freedom of philosophizing. And there is something completely and radically new in this libertas philosophandi, because it means in this late 18th century understanding that there are many academic subjects, for example, theology and law and medicine, somehow the dominant academic subjects in this time. But these dominating academic subjects are very much bound by societal norms, by the norms of law and religion and medicine and medical police, as this time calls it. But besides this dominating subjects, there is philosophy. And philosophy claims, and that's a completely new situation, a libertas, a liberty to look somehow critically and with a critical understanding at these norms which have to be accepted by theologians or legal scholars or medical persons uncritically. And there is a new understanding in this. It's for the first time that the idea of freedom of science is closely coupled to the idea of criticism. That's the novelty in the Enlightenment and the late 18th century situation. And then again, a few decades later, there is against a transition, and there is this new idea of a freedom of research and teaching. Sometimes learning is added to it, but only sometimes. But at the core is this freedom of research and teaching. And the new term clearly is research. This wasn't there before 1790, and only in the decades after 1790, it's more clearly articulated. And research means the expansion of the critical testing and the critical renewing of all knowledge. It means the expansion of this critical spirit and the incessant search for criticism and for new knowledge, the expanding of this critical spirit on all scientific disciplines. They all now do research, and that means they do not repeat knowledge, but they research knowledge. They try to find it as if it were completely new knowledge. And that is a radically new understanding in the early 19th century situation. And freedom of science is now the freedom of research, the freedom of this radical search for new knowledge. And secondly, the coupling of this freedom of research to teaching. And this claims that teaching is done in the same spirit of a radical search for new knowledge. And this universality of the critical spirit is the new basis of the freedom of science in the early 19th century situation. Philosophy then loses its privileged status. Criticism is not only done by philosophers, but by all scientists. And philosophy has to redefine itself as one of the scientific disciplines. And then, some decades later, it's for the first time that you find, and that's after 1850, that you find talks and tracts and books on freedom of science. And science is now for the first time seen as a universal knowledge system of its own. And that implies that it somehow cuts its exclusive link to universities and becomes a universal knowledge system, of course, still coupled to universities, but coupled to other scientific institutions too. And now you find the claim for freedom of science as a claim for the freedom of this universal knowledge system and the expansion and the renewal and the incessant renewal of this universal knowledge system. Please switch to the next slide. And again, of course, there is a continuity of understanding of this understanding of freedom of science, a continuity of understanding which lasts until our days. I think that's clear. In some respects, we understand freedom of science in the same way it was understood already in the late 19th century situation. But if you look at the 20th and 21st century literature, you find one interesting switch. Often the term autonomy is substituted for freedom. It's often spoken of autonomy of science or autonomy of higher education. And somehow, in some respects, it's the same term. In other respects, it's a different term. And it's important to understand what makes the difference. If you look at autonomy and if you look at its Greek roots, it means autos nomos. It speaks about rules, which are the rules who are created by the same institution in which these rules are institutionalized. One self invents and practices and controls the rules by which a system is ruled or regulated. That means autonomy of science defines the freedom of science by the self-regulation of a system by its own rules. The system is no longer understood as independent. It's not independent. Of course, science is not independent. It has many dependencies built into the system because it's a societal institution. Therefore, science can no longer understood as independent, but it's self-regulated. It regulates its dependencies on the basis of rules. It invents itself for itself. And that's somehow the semantic difference, which is created and institutionalized by this new term of autonomy, which until our days somehow accompanies the idea of freedom of science. They are somehow synonyms, and in other respects, they are different. And that leads me in some respects to my last central point focused on contemporary society, this modern system of science, which is now no longer a European system of science, but is a world system of science, and somehow claims freedom for science and autonomy of science as a world system of autonomous free science. And this world system of science is that I have to say as a sociologist is based on values, norms, and institutions. And the study of the freedom of science in the 20th century and in the early 21st century clearly is the study of the values, norms, and institutions of science. And the question, if these values, norms, and institutions of science are somehow stable, guaranteed, and how their evolution now looks like. And I will very briefly look at some candidates. And of course, there are many formulations, many ideas, and many alternatives. But I will look at some of the core values, core norms, and central institutions of science. If you look at values, and you know what a value is, I suppose. A value is a preference institutionalized in society. It's only a preference. It's not a strict norm, but it's something you would like to have, although you often have no sanctions if it doesn't arise. But still, even if values are only preferences, there are important aspects of structure formation in society. And among these values of present-day science clearly are truth, or the truth orientation. There is this very central idea of research, which has sometimes been called by historians and sociologists the research imperative, which means that to do research is somehow imperative for any person who wants to participate in science. There is cognitive rationality as one of the other values, and you might name theoretical curiosity as one of the other central values, and you may prolong this list, but I stop it here and go to the next point. perhaps still more central to the institutionalization of the freedom of modern contemporary science. And there is a very interesting formulation to which I look back in the norms I noted on this slide. There is an American sociologist of science, Robert King Merton, who in the late 30s, early 40s, for the first time tried to describe a canon of the norms of science, which somehow functions as a protective normative core of science, which as a protective core protects the freedom of science by the institutionalization of these norms. And Merton generated an interesting list of 4 core norms, which may still be valid in describing and researching the freedom of science. These 4 norms are organized skepticism, and that means there is nothing which cannot be looked at with a certain skeptical attitude. Criticism is always possible, and in some respects, criticism is always obligatory for some person participating in science. That is what organized skepticism means. There is universalism, and universalism, that's the second norm, means everybody, wherever he or she comes from and lives in, and whatever characteristics a person may have as individual and social peculiarities, he or she will always be allowed to participate in science and against no one may be discriminated on the basis of social peculiarities or characteristics. That is what universalism means. There is what Merton called communism, and that means scientific knowledge belongs to everyone. Nobody can be excluded from it. It has to be accessible in principle for everybody living on Earth. And there is finally the 4th norm that Merton called disinterestedness. You have to search for scientific truth and scientific knowledge in a somehow disinterested spirit. It's not for money, and it's not because it suits your religious attitudes. It is knowledge which you have to look for its own. And it's interesting, and I think, and that I can't do today, but that is somehow the way one should do research on the reality of the freedom of science. And if you do want to do this research on the reality of the freedom of science in different regions of the world, you probably will have to look at the reality of these 4 norms. That is what Merton proposed, and I somehow suppose it's still true. It may prove still to be a very apt instrument to do research on the reality of the freedom of science. I will only make one very small test. If you look at China, and if you look at Chinese humanities and social sciences, there is this remarkable proposal which became ever more prominent in the last 10 to 15 years, that Chinese humanities and social sciences are humanities and social sciences which are somehow coupled to Chinese characteristics. That's the formulation which is used in China. It's always about social science and humanities with Chinese characteristics. And that is demanded by researchers doing research in China, and it's used as an argument against criticism directed to some researchers who criticize aspects of Chinese humanities and social sciences. And this remarkable idea that there exists such a thing as social science and humanities with Chinese characteristics is a clear case to violate organized skepticism. Somehow this kind of knowledge is no longer allowed to be criticized. And it's a clear violation of universalism, because it's probably the case that science with Chinese characteristic can only be produced by people with Chinese origin or working in China. And it produces a special category, and there are clear violations of core Mertonian norms. And it's only a small example, and you have to study it more extensively, but it somehow shows the usefulness of this core structures of norms. Finally, and that are my final remarks, you have to look at the institutions of science, which somehow are again institutions arising in the history of science and somehow protecting and realizing the freedom of science. And there are many of them, very, very many. I only wrote down 3 of them on this slide. The publication, which is a very special, very well protected, very strange invention. A scientific publication looks completely different from a article in a newspaper. It's created and written and endowed with citations and many other abstracts and many other things which are not there in a journal, in a newspaper article. It's a very special invention, and it's one of these institutions of science which by its stability somehow participate in the creation and realization of the freedom of science. And there are others, I had here 2 others, but there are many institutions, universities, or a point which came about today, funding, stability of funding. This may be counted among the institutions of science, but I can't go into it. And I only have a last point, and I can't speak about it more extensive, but such a system of science described by the values and norms and institutions, and the freedom of which is somehow ensured and stabilized by values, norms, and institutions, then still is in our days connected with society in innumerable way. And I think, but that's a topic of its own, these connections between science and societies are primarily mediated today via problems. There are problems of society, problems of science. Science observes problems of society and tells society that there is a problem, for example, climate change. Society may accept this problem and give it back to science and say, do research on us for us. And this exchange between science and society is today very much based on the definition, the understanding, the renewal, the exchange of problems. But such a system of science which can contribute to the solution of societal problems clearly demands freedom of science. And that's this core understanding of science, which has a long evolution, but clearly converges in the 20th and 21st situation to a somehow stable core that is in some respects a world institution of science. Thank you very much.
Professor Stichweh, nós estamos aqui.
Nós estamos aqui já 10 minutos do final de nossa mesa, mas conseguimos 15 minutos de we have achieved 15 minutes of extension. I'm sorry, we are reaching the 10 minutes before the end of our round table, and we have had very interesting moments. These questions that I will ask you will be directed at all the participants, and I will give you all 5 minutes to answer. The questions pertain to the existence of the observatory in Brazil, and the observatory was created recently. It has this mission to deal with academic freedom and generate knowledge about that, but we as yet do not have consistent information. We have just begun to produce it. For instance, the topic of brain drain in Brazil, we still do not have solid data to be consolidated to cover the whole country. This was a question asked by Márcio, and I'm already anticipating the questions referring to all the participants linked to the reaction between freedom and the idea of social equality and universalism, how to broaden access to scientific knowledge. I have some questions that ask how science has tried to communicate and disclose knowledge, and some questions also from Márcio asking if there is an index on academic freedom on what is being done. There is at publications. There is Scholars at Risk that publish annually on the attacks made to science, and but we are still trying to include in the ranking and the scientific link academic freedom with all its parameters. But it's not as yet consolidated, and it's not present yet. What people want to know is the relationship between science and its efforts to try and talk to a more extensive community. What is the social responsibility of science to extend its knowledge to the population? And this came from participants who are researchers and work in the education of and teaching science. There is also a very interesting question that seems to be very challenging, which is how we can, based on these abstract parameters, to think about academic freedom, to think about the current dynamic that implies a correlation between an erosion of the political and particularly institutional system and the extensive use of citizens of social network. In other words, the impact, how we can think the relationship between science and democracy, thinking about the challenge of these new forms of direct action that are being encouraged by the social media. And that raise an interesting point that's a difficult one, that how we can think about democracy through its more conventional institution being affected by these direct participation stimulated by the media. And this seems a very interesting question. And the last set of questions is related to what we are able to compare. The relationship between science and democracy in Europe, and the relationship between science and democracy in the Americas, probably thinking about more about Central and South America in this case. But how we can think about this north-south relationship and how we can compare those relationships between science and democracy, scientific freedom and science, generally speaking. I will give the floor to Professor Otávio, following the order in which we started, and I'll ask our German speakers. They need not speak about the whole of Europe, but they can speak based on their experience in Germany, to just as a basis of comparison. I don't think I will be able to approach most of these questions and answer them, so I will make a few quick comments of what I understood from what was said by our German colleagues, and that is linked to some of the questions that were asked. And I would like to say that with regard to our first colleague, I enjoyed his expression scientific stance, and I believe this is linked to what I call the scientific ethos, and the idea of a scientific stance as something that is not identified or does not identified with skepticism, or the idea that all opinions have the same weight from the standpoint of science. And this is an issue and that is very present in Brazil currently. And I agree with this position. I believe that our colleague also mentioned in passing the issue of scientific education. And I believe that it's one of the ways in which we can try to see the questions that were asked here. We have had several experiences in Brazil, as well as attempts to think about scientific education. Unfortunately, however, we are still very late with regards to that in our educational system. I think the new management of SBPC will be heavily concerned with that, because the new chairman was the Minister of Education of the country, and I hope that this discussion will go forward and it will be promoted by ourselves during his administration. There was also a reference in the first lecture about the need of democratic relationship, that scientists do not remain enclosed in their ivory tower. This is very interesting. I think it's quite true. We must agree. However, I would like to signal a paradox in Brazil. My personal opinion is that in a situation where there is greater authoritarianism, that there is a decrease in this stance of existing within an ivory tower, because the science communities is forced to look for allies and work together with society, precisely because it finds itself under threat. We have that in the dictatorship.
And how we can develop a permanent scientific stance. At the moment, a meeting like that in SBPC expresses exactly our relation with the society, because it's open to the public in general. We should have a statistic about the origin of people that are attending to our meeting. But I want to mention an example for scientific maturity for a moment like this. In this moment, 1 year ago, in the middle of the difficulties that we are living in, the Brazilian Academy for Science elected a known indigenous shaman And this shows the need, the possibility that is open to collaborate with society. This history that was shown by our other colleague since the 12th century, it's something that really caught our attention. It's that if the history of the universities come from the 12th century in Brazil, they began in the 20th century. And if we add the historical past of slaves, of colonialism during centuries, and the historical lack of education, I ask myself, up till which point this explains the difficulties we are going through or not. Since I tried to say in my lecture, some of the difficulties we are going through are not exclusivity of Brazil. Many countries with a lot of education and instruction have also their times of authoritarianism. And how to explain that? It's an interesting paradox. The anti-vaccine movement that is very strong in Europe, here in Brazil, even if the government is at the same opinion, the vaccination is higher here, as it seems to me, as in other European countries. And at last, to end, I would want to mention some words from Robert Merton, how to think about sciences. I think it could be interesting, and it's an effort as a sociologist in the sciences, how this ideal norms that was suggested by him and somehow were institutionalized in his ideological stance, how these are really practiced by the scientists in their activities in everyday life and their activities in the labs. Who really was highlighted during this discussion was the Bruno Latour from France. Many people don't like him, but we need really to go deeper into this discussion. I will end here because our time is limited. Thank you very much, Professor Otávio. Now I will hand over the floor to Professor Michael. Professor, please. We don't hear you. Please, the floor is yours. Não ouvimos ainda o professor. While Professor Quante is solving the problem of our technical structure, I want to offer the floor to Professor Rudolf so he can enrich us with his final contribution. And we have just 10 minutes to end our activities. Professor Stichweh, please assume.
Já está. Então,
he's
por
back.
favor,
Okay.
Quante.
So, Professor Quante, please. Eu espero que vocês possam me ouvir agora. Muito bem. Então, eu agradeço. Eu vou manter tudo bastante rápido e curto.
Idea today has been to also ask what we as scientists can do to improve the situation, to overcome this rule, the role of being complaining and understanding ourselves as victims only of the oppression which we are in some sense. And my imperatives are very simple. If times and society change, science has to change. And education and communication is the only way out. We have to risk it to trust young people to get into dialogue and to invent new formats. Nobody actually knows how to do it, but we in Germany also try to establish these things, because in terms of mass education, of mass media and mass disinformation, we have to be active, to go to the people, go to their places and start very early to introduce them in our way of thinking and fight for our life form as scientists as something democracy needs. And we have to demonstrate it as a virtue. This is the basic idea I do have. If we don't establish ourselves as role models for civil courage and for democracy, we will be the victims in the end, because all the other powers are so strong and economically so strong, and our only resource are the young humans who are eager to learn and change the world and change societies, and we can help, and we should learn from them and be part of them. This is what I think is what we have to understand ourselves. And in some sense, I could quote a former chancellor of us: let's risk more democracy within science and in interaction with society. This is the only way, and it's a risky way, and it's an open way, and so we don't have the tools actually to answer all these problems and questions you've asked us today, but we have to figure it out together. There's no alternative than cooperation and try to bring our values through against the oppression and resistance in the world and the irrationality in the political systems worldwide. This is the only thing I can say today. And never give up. That's the main point. Never give up and be solidaric to those. I say this to my German colleagues, to those in the world who are more oppressed and really in a danger. Be solidaric there and don't shy away to be clear, to say what we want to do and that we have to interact. This is, I think, for today what I want to say to all who are listening to us.
Muitíssimo obrigada, Professor Quante.
Thank you very much, Professor Quante, to take part in this discussion. And now I offer the floor to Professor Stichweh. Professor Stichweh, you have the floor. Now, finally, we can begin to offer you the floor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will make a final remark on science and democracy, and I think there are and I suppose you already could take it from my talk, but I will re-emphasize or strengthen the point. I suppose there are historically and in our days very strong connections from democracy to science. You could say these two societal institutions are in many respects very close towards one another. And I only will mention 2 or 3 points. If you look at the genesis of modern democracies, they are strongly coupled to the rise of something which is called the public sphere. And the public sphere is a space which has first been described for countries around 1800. It's a space in which any argument may be articulated, in which every person is allowed to articulate any political position, and in which political debate incessantly goes on. And that's clearly very near to what is called organized skepticism on the scientific side. And therefore, my point would be if you have no democracy and no public space in which an somehow unlimited political debate can go on, you will always get restrictions on criticism, on skepticism, and in science, and the other way around. Therefore, I see this very strong link between the public sphere of the political system, that you, in some respects, only have in a democracy, and organized skepticism as a core norm and institution of the modern system of science. And you can repeat the argument. If you look at democracies, they are based on equal rights for all members of a political system. You always have, that's democracy, you have one man, one woman, one vote. That means all persons being members of a political system have the same relevance, have the same votes. And that's, again, very closely coupled to the idea of universalism in science. You are not allowed to discriminate against scientific positions on the basis of memberships or belongings or background or whatever. Again, you have this very strong link from universal voting rights in democratic political systems and the universalism of participation in science systems. Again, you will have problems in science if you don't have a democratic voting system. At last point, I think democracy is in many respects a political system that only takes decisions that can be revised tomorrow. Majorities may change, voters may prefer other parties, governments can be exchanged against new governments, and that means all decisions are reversible and can be, if they are no longer accepted, can be substituted by new decisions. And that's very near to the experimental spirit which characterizes the system of science. There are very clear links between this provisional, reversible character of democratic political systems and the experimental spirit that characterizes modern science. That's an old argument. It has always already been realized in, say, late 19th century society. American pragmatism, for example, was strongly based on this way of comparing the democratic experimentalism and scientific experimentalism. And that's another very strong link between these institutions. Therefore, it will always be difficult to have free science if you live in an authoritarian situation. It's not all lost. That would be too strong. For example, you always have these links to world science, and that somehow helps. If you have to live in an authoritarian situation, you can migrate, or you can cooperate, or you can publish at other places. And there are some possibilities, and these possibilities are given by this character of science being a world institution. But in principle, freedom of science in medium or long terms will be endangered and perhaps even disappear if you don't succeed to establish democracies.
Muitíssimo obrigada. Pelo que notamos, já passamos até do tempo de
We are over the time to finish our roundtable. We have a lot still to discuss for future generations, and our academic interactions are very welcome in this relationship that we have had in the last 11 years. And obviously, it will last many more years. I profoundly thank to all the lecturers, and I want to hand over the floor to Matthew for the final remarks based on the viewpoint of DWIH. Marcio, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Hello, do you hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Maria Filomena. Thank you very much for the moderation. It was excellent. And congratulations to the pronunciation of DWIH, Professor Quante, Stichweh, and Velho for your presentations. All presentations were different, showing us the diversity about this topic. Before we close this event, I would add, if we don't know the German Center for Research and Innovation, our installations in São Paulo, we have offices and we represent many foreign institutions in Germany. Many other scientific societies are related to DWIH. We have a huge agenda of events to promote scientific interchange, looking to innovation. Please visit our website where you can also subscribe our newsletter with information about scholarships and other events. Our website is being disclosed on the chat. You can also find us in Facebook and LinkedIn. To the SBPC, a huge thank you for this partnership. A special thank you to Professor Moreira, that in this second term at the society asked us to become members, and Professor Ribeiro that will take over on Friday, and we will continue with our partnership. We wish everyone all the best.
O Centro Alemão de Ciência e Inovação de São Paulo faz parte de uma rede de 5 centros. Nós temos um centro em Nova York, um em Moscou, um em Nova Delhi e um em Tóquio. E essa rede de centros está hoje dentro do DAD, como uma estrutura de internacionalização da ciência, da pesquisa alemã.
O DAD é o Serviço Alemão de Intercâmbio Acadêmico. Nós somos uma organização que representa as instituições do ensino superior na Alemanha. E nosso objetivo é de promover a internacionalização dos estudos superiores no mundo inteiro. Nós podemos dizer a todos os cientistas brasileiros são bem-vindos de encontrar aqui no DWIH colegas da Alemanha e encontrar parceiros alemães pela sua pesquisa.
O Centro Alemão de Ciência e Inovação em São Paulo é um modelo pela cooperação entre a Alemanha e o Brasil. Ele cria conexões e constrói pontes entre estudantes, cientistas e pesquisadores. Para garantir prosperidade sustentável para as futuras gerações, os nossos países precisam de inovação e ciência. O centro é um importante impulsor dessa inovação e mostra o potencial da nossa cooperação. Juntos somos mais fortes.
Os objetivos da rede dos centros alemães são estimular a cooperação científica, ou seja, colocando os cientistas em contato para promover o intercâmbio de conhecimento, gerar novos projetos entre cientistas da Alemanha e de outros países, promovendo não só a transferência, mas a geração de conhecimento e de tecnologias voltada, por exemplo, para a geração de inovações. Nossos principais eventos e anuais são, em primeiro lugar, o diálogo. O Diálogo Brasil-Alemanha de Ciência, Pesquisa e Inovação que a gente faz junto com a FAPESP. É a nossa grande plataforma de intercâmbio de conhecimento entre cientistas do Brasil e da Alemanha. Segundo grande evento, a gente participa da reunião anual da SBPC, Sociedade Brasileira para o Progresso da Ciência. E junto com a Câmara de Comércio Brasil-Alemanha, a gente organiza o Congresso Brasil-Alemanha de Inovação. Então, neste evento, a gente contribui trazendo o que há de mais recente em termos de conhecimento científico que a gente traz da Alemanha. E na área para jovens pesquisadores, nós realizamos no Brasil o concurso Fallen Walls Lab, que classifica um participante para a final em Berlim. Temos ainda, também em parceria com a Câmara de Comércio, o programa Startups Connected, em que nós concedemos um prêmio a uma startup alemã interessada em vir ao Brasil.
Pensamos que o DWIH justamente tem essa missão de conectar os científicos alemãos com os colegas brasileiros. E então é lógico que nós não fazemos esse trabalho sozinho, mas com um parceiro. E o melhor parceiro que temos aqui no estado de São Paulo, evidentemente, é a FAPESP.
A relação da comunidade científica brasileira com a Alemanha é muito tradicional. São temas de ciência, de tecnologia, de inovação. Então é compreensível que a cooperação entre duas comunidades científicas seja muito produtiva, em geral causando impactos sempre maiores do que iniciativas de pesquisa feitas isoladamente.
A troca e o aproveitamento da experiência, da inovação, da tecnologia do futuro vindo da Alemanha é fundamental. E o DWIH é um facilitador do acesso a essa tecnologia e inovação para as empresas alemãs.
A DWIH, como a sociedade científica aqui, que representa um país que tem uma ciência de excelência absoluta e alta tecnologia, é extremamente proveitosa essas parcerias. Eu acho que elas terminam sendo benéficas aos dois lados.
Com a criação do DWIH, foi possível elevar a importância do Brasil a nível mundial. E a parceria entre o setor privado e o mundo científico, a academia, é fundamental para promover as relações bilaterais.
Junto com o DWIH e também com outras instituições, a gente busca promover esse intercâmbio Brasil-Alemanha de startups. Então a gente seleciona também sempre uma startup alemã para participar no Congresso Brasil-Alemanha de Inovação e também de uma viagem de negócios aqui no Brasil para promover essa parceria Brasil e Alemanha. E isso, graças ao DWIH, a gente consegue fazer já há 3 anos.
Wir haben uns sehr, sehr gefreut, den Preis zu gewinnen. Das ist natürlich eine Riesenmöglichkeit für uns, hier in Brasilien Kontakte zu knüpfen, andere Firmen kennenzulernen, die uns vielleicht helfen können, hier in Brasilien Fuß zu fassen und so vor allem die Sensebox auch in Südamerika tatsächlich bekannter zu machen.
Promovemos aqui intercâmbio acadêmico, científico, juntamente com o meio empresarial ou com interlocutores da sociedade ou da administração pública para promover o progresso.